Discuss this story is Global World Affairs analyst Marco Vicenzino. Marco, welcome to the programme. Undoubtedly, big propaganda victories again for Islamic State this week. But can you give us the military significance?
Sure. On the propaganda side, it's important to emphasize also is the fact that what they do is that they extend this sense of inevitability of victory and that aura of invincibility, which does a lot to instill fear into its enemies. And also these victories, these ground victories, they feed into their narrative as a fact that ordinary Sunnis have no alternative to the only alternative they have is ISIS, and usually the only people who can protect them is an American Air Force with a Shiite army backed by Iran. So these victories fall into that in assisting in that narrative. Now, going to the military front, on the military front, we have to look at three key areas. One is the takeover of Ramadi, one is the takeover of the border post, and the other one is Palmyra. Now, if you look at the takeover of Ramadi, for the most part, it's not so much that it's ISIS as their military strength. It's more, I says, about the weakness of the Iraqi military army, of the regular army, which basically has to now rely on the strength of Iraqi militias, Shiite militias. Secondly, if you look at the border posts now, there's three border posts between Syria and Iraq. The one in the north is controlled by the Kurds, and the two others are controlled by ISIS now. So as a effect, they have a de facto control of the border between Syria and Iraq and move freely along the two. Thirdly, Palmyra is probably the most important of the three, because one needs to distinguish between Syria and Iraq. Now we're talking about Syria. The key strategic city of Palmyra has its rich in resources, oil, gas, and also as a fact of logistical importance. You have two direct highways, one that goes straight to the capital, Damascus, and the other one that goes to Homs. Now, it's not that they're going to storm Damascus immediately. What's going to happen is that they're going to try to relieve a siege of the eastern suburbs held by the rebels. Homs is important because Homs is a key city that controls the corridor between the capital, Damascus, and the homeland of the Alawites and the Assad regime, which is Latakia.
And they really show no sign of stopping. I mean, a few months ago, the fall of Sinjar and Kobani were seen as defeats for Islamic State, and there was a lot of talk about, well, perhaps maybe not the tide has been turned, but at least Islamic State is on the back foot. And suddenly, in the last week or two, we've seen these huge gains again. I mean, what is the key to their military success? Why have they been so successful on the
military success? A lot has to do with effectiveness on the battlefield, discipline, highly motivated, and the fact of propaganda war. They're extremely, and they both feed into each other. And on the propaganda war, what they do is that it allows them to attract resources, attract recruits, and that brings more support. So one feeds into the other. Now, if you look at Kobani, for example, you distinguish between Iraq and Syria. If you look at Kobani, which is on the border between Syria and Iraq and Turkey, Kobani was more of an exception. In Syria, they've been gradually progressing, consolidating their territory and gaining more, as we saw in the takeover of Palmyra. In the east, in Iraq, what happened was the American bombing, for the most part, thwarted their advance last year. Now, you can't win this simply with air power, but what it does is that they still have control of the majority of the Anbar province, but they're still making territorial gains and consolidating their positions. So they basically can now control a third of Iraq and half the territory of Syria today.
And, I mean, you mentioned the U.S. Bombing campaign, and it is exactly that. No U.S. troops on the ground other than troops training Iraqis in Iraq. Again, these recent victories surely point to a failure of the U.S. strategy in containing Islamic State.
Okay, so here you have the training of the Iraqi regular army and the airstrikes. The airstrikes initially proved effective. Once again, it's about thwarting the advance. You can't win a war, but you can thwart their advance. And where it's worked well, it's particularly in the north. If you look at the Kurdish regions, due to the aerial support given to the Kurds have been able to consolidate, hold their ground and their territory. In the south, it's been a different story. But in Syria itself, American air power, America has no reliable ground allies in Syria. And then in Iraq, the ground forces is basically relying upon Iraqi Shiite militias. So the Americans are not in a good situation, no matter how many words President Obama wants to use. This is sort of an embarrassment. One can frankly say it's an embarrassment for the Americans.
Because they've been downplaying these recent successes, the U.S. authorities, haven't they, saying, you know, a tactical defeat, or don't worry, we're going to win in the long term. term. But
in the long term, the training of the Iraqi troops takes time, and in due time they can train them. But now time is of the essence. You need effective fighting forces on the ground, and the Americans, in reality, the Iraqi regular army cannot fight on its own. It needs the support of these Shiite militias, and when the Americans can say in the long run, yeah, well, that's fine in the long run, but for now, there's not an effective fighting force on the ground that the Americans are actually backing.
Okay, Marco Vicenzino, thank you very much for joining us here on The World Tonight.